History is not a straight line. It is a chaotic river filled with currents and countercurrents, where a single pebble dropped in the water can create ripples that change the course of everything. We often think of history as a grand, inevitable march of progress. But sometimes the fate of empires, the future of languages, and the very shape of the world we live in can hinge on a single moment, on a single heartbeat, on the flight of a single solitary arrow. In the autumn of the year 1066, on a bloody field in southern England, such an arrow was loosed into the sky. It was a piece of wood and iron, weighing no more than a few ounces. But as it arced towards the heavens, it carried with it the weight of destiny. This is the story of how that one arrow, striking one man, at one precise moment, did not just end a battle. It ended a world and gave birth. This is the story of the Battle of Hastings, and the arrow that changed everything. Our story begins, as so many stories of conflict do, with the death of a king. In January of 1066, Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king of England, died. His death created a power vacuum, a void that three of the most powerful men in Europe were determined to fill. The first claimant was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, a man of immense wealth and political skill. He was English, he was respected, and he was on the scene. On the very day of King Edward's funeral, Harold was crowned King of England. For the English people, he was the natural successor, their best defense against foreign influence. But Harold knew his crown rested uneasily on his head. Two other claimants were watching from across the sea, and both believed the throne was theirs by right. In the north, there was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a giant of a man, a legendary Viking warrior who had fought and plundered his way from the frozen seas of the north to the golden gates of Constantinople. He was a living saga, the last of the great Viking kings, and he based his claim on an old, murky agreement between his predecessor and a previous king of England. He saw England as the final, glorious prize in a lifetime of conquest. And then, across the narrow channel to the south, there was William, the Duke of Normandy, a ruthless, cunning, and brutally effective ruler. William's claim was more personal. He insisted that years earlier, King Edward had promised him the throne. He also claimed that Harold Godwinson himself had been shipwrecked in Normandy and had sworn a holy oath on sacred relics to support William's claim. When Harold took the crown, William saw it not just as a political maneuver, but as a personal betrayal and a mortal sin. He immediately began to prepare for an invasion. The stage was set for a three-way war for the soul of England. Harold Godwinson, now King of England, knew he was trapped. He had two powerful enemies poised to attack from two different directions. He spent the spring and summer of 1066 gathering his army, the famous Anglo-Saxon Fyrd, a militia of free men bound to defend the kingdom. He positioned his forces on the southern coast of England, staring out at the Channel, waiting for William's fleet to appear. But the winds in the Channel were unfavorable. William's invasion was delayed week after week. Harold's army, composed mostly of farmers, grew restless. Their supplies dwindled and the harvest season was upon them. They needed to return to their fields. In early September, with no sign of the Norman fleet, Harold made a fateful decision. He disbanded his southern army. It was a calculated risk, and it backfired spectacularly. Just as his men were marching home, news arrived from the north. A massive Viking fleet had landed. Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, had invaded. He had already captured the city of York and was laying waste to the northern countryside. Harold Godwinson had no choice. He remounted his horse, gathered his personal army of elite housecarls, and began a legendary forced march north. He covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, a stunning feat of medieval logistics. He caught the Viking army completely by surprise. On September 25th, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the two armies clashed. The battle was a bloodbath. The Anglo-Saxons fought with a desperate fury. Harald Hardrada, fighting like a berserker without his mail armor, was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed. The Viking invasion was crushed. It was a total, stunning victory for King Harold. He had defeated one of his rivals and secured his kingdom. But as his men tended to their wounds and celebrated on the battlefield, a messenger arrived, breathless, carrying the news that Harold had been dreading for months. 3 days after the battle at Stamford Bridge, the winds in the Channel had finally changed. William the Conqueror had landed in the south. The situation was now impossible. Harold's army was battered, exhausted, and hundreds of miles away from the new invasion site. A lesser man might have waited, rested his troops, and gathered reinforcements. But Harold was a man of action. He believed in momentum. He made another incredible forced march, racing his weary army back down the length of England to confront the Normans. It was a decision that would seal his fate. On the morning of October 14th, Harold's Anglo-Saxon army arrived and took up a defensive position atop a small ridge known to history as Senlac Hill. They formed the shield wall. This was the ultimate defensive tactic of the age. A tightly packed formation of men, shoulder to shoulder, their round shields interlocked, creating an almost impenetrable barrier of wood and steel. From behind this wall they could hurl spears and strike with their fearsome long axes. For a cavalry-heavy army like William's Normans, it was a nightmare. The battle began around 9 in the morning. The Norman archers loosed their arrows, but they were largely ineffective, thudding harmlessly against the high wall of shields. William then ordered his infantry and cavalry to charge up the hill. Again and again they charged, and again they were repulsed. The Anglo-Saxons held their ground, their great axes cleaving through helmets and armor. The sound was deafening. The clash of steel, the splintering of wood, the screams of men and horses. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and exhausting. For hours the shield wall held. At one point a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that William himself had been killed. Panic began to set in. William, seeing his army about to break, rode into the fray, lifted his helmet to show his face, and rallied his men, shouting, "I live, and by God's grace, I will conquer." The battle raged on. The Normans tried a clever tactic, a feigned retreat. They charged, then pretended to flee in panic, hoping to lure the English from their strong defensive position. Some of the inexperienced English firemen fell for the trap, breaking formation to chase the retreating Normans, only to be cut down when the Norman cavalry turned on them. But the core of the shield wall, the veteran housecarls around King Harold, held firm. As the day wore on, the sun began to sink towards the horizon. The battlefield was a grim tableau of mud, blood, and corpses. The English, though exhausted, were still holding the ridge. They had been fighting for over 8 hours. They had withstood countless cavalry charges and infantry assaults. William's army was on the verge of defeat. He was running out of options and running out of daylight. He made one last, desperate gambit. He ordered his archers to change their tactics. Instead of firing directly at the shield wall, he commanded them to fire high into the air, to let their arrows rain down on the men behind the shields from above. Thousands of arrows arced into the twilight sky, like a deadly man-made storm. They reached the apex of their flight, and then they began to fall. And it was at this moment history held its breath. We don't know for certain what happened next. The historical accounts are fragmented and contradictory, but the most famous and enduring account, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, tells a story of incredible, tragic chance. One of those thousands of falling arrows came down at a precise angle, at a precise second, and struck the one man it could not afford to strike. It pierced the eye slit of his helmet and plunged into the brain of King Harold Godwinson. He fell mortally wounded. His death at that critical moment was the turning point. The English line, seeing their king fall, lost heart. The impenetrable shield wall began to waver. The Normans, sensing victory, launched one final ferocious charge. They smashed through the faltering line, and the battle turned into a rout. The English army was annihilated. By the time darkness fell, the Anglo-Saxon age was over. A new era, the Norman era, had begun, all because of a single random arrow. The consequences of that moment were almost unimaginable. The Norman conquest was not just a change of king. It was a complete and total revolution of English society. The entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was wiped out and replaced by a French-speaking Norman elite. The English language itself was forever altered, infused with thousands of French and Latin words, transforming it from a purely Germanic tongue into the rich, hybrid language we speak today. Without that arrow, words like government, parliament, justice, and liberty would not exist in English. William the Conqueror introduced feudalism and built the great castles and cathedrals that still dot the English landscape. His legal and administrative reforms laid the groundwork for the common law system, a system that would later be inherited by the United States, Canada, and Australia. The chain of events that followed, the Plantagenet kings, the 100 Years' War with France, the rise of the British Empire, all of it stems from that single bloody day at Hastings. If that arrow had flown a few inches to the left or right, if Harold Godwinson had survived the battle and repelled the invasion, the world we know today would be unrecognizable. England might have remained a Scandinavian-facing Germanic nation. The French language would not have shaped its destiny. The British Empire, as we know it, may never have existed. The history of North America would have been completely different. The arrow that struck King Harold is a powerful symbol, a symbol of how history turns on a knife's edge. It reminds us that the world is not shaped by grand, unstoppable forces alone, but by chaos, chance, and moments of incredible, brutal luck. One man's death became the birth of a new world. And we are all, in some way, living in the long, deep shadow cast by that single, fateful arrow fired into a twilight sky over 1,000 years ago. What do you think is the single most impactful moment in human history? Share your thoughts in the comments below.